Good day, scholars. We are examining today Standard 21, that is, Analyze U.S. international and domestic policies, including their influences on technological advancements and social change during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. All right, Substandard A. Analyze the international policies and actions taken as a response to the Cold War, including U.S. involvement in Cuba and the escalation of the war in Vietnam as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the American-supported leader of Cuba, Batista. Ooh, Lord have mercy. Cuba, only 90 miles from the U.S. mainland, took control of all U.S. property in Cuba, including land and factories. The new Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, aligned his government with the Soviet Union. So here we almost have an identical situation as we talked about last standard with the Korean War. But this time, instead of us being trying to occupy or assist a government close to the Soviet Union was assisting and aiding a country close to the United States. All right, Bay of Pigs. When John Kennedy became president in 1961, he inherited a plan from the previous president which called for a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba in order to overthrow Castro. And of course, the previous president here was Dwight Eisenhower. All right. So they already had a plan developed in which they would go into Cuba and help their rebels reoccupy Cuba to overthrow Castro. The U.S. worried that the Soviet Union would use Cuba as a base to spread communism through the Western Hemisphere. Though only the president, for 3 months, Kennedy listened to his advisors and approved the secret plan which called for 1,500 Cubans exiles to attack, and which was supported by U.S. planes, as I stated before. All right, the attack was a disaster. News of the attack leaked out days before it happened. The Bay of Pigs was poorly chosen with coral reefs, well, the attack site, and it slowed down the land craft, and of course the swampy land on the shore didn't help at all either. In addition to hide U.S. involvement, Kennedy refused to send in the expected air support. Within days, Cuba had captured or killed the invaders. In 1962, U.S. spies planes photographed Soviet-made long-range missiles being set up in Cuba. All right. And as you can see, that little long strip of land is Cuba. You can see it has the Bay of Pigs outlined there. And then you can also see Guantanamo Bay as well. And look how close it is to Florida. As you can see in that upper section, you can see Florida, and it's just 90 miles away from Florida. So think about it. It's less than the distance, really less than the distance from Birmingham, Alabama to Atlanta. So it's It's very close, extremely close, especially for it to be another country and an ideal spot for um, the Soviet Union as well. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba, demanded that the Soviets dismantle and remove the missiles, and warned Russia that the U.S. would launch all-out nuclear missile attack, launch an all-out nuclear missile attack on the Soviet Union if any missiles were fired from Cuba. So this was a huge event in and of its time, huge event in and of its time, and it this is probably one of the closest, if not the closest, that we have come to uh, war one-on-one with Russia. The Soviets ignored the warning and continued to work on the site. Many in the U.S. believed that a nuclear holocaust would occur in late October after secretly negotiating with the Soviets. Disaster was avoided. Uh, Russia agreed to pull out of Cuba if the U.S. promised not to invade the island. So they struck a compromise, a somewhat deal that prevented um, nuclear war. And there was much fear at the time over nuclear war. Uh, Even some U.S. leaders even thought it was inevitable. But I think it's best for the world that this did not happen. All right, Vietnam War, that was from 1955 to 1975, so 20 years. The U.S. had been sending economic and military aid to South Vietnam since the early 1950s to combat North North Vietnamese communist government. By 1963, the U.S. had over 16,000, excuse me, advisors in South Vietnam. So this is also what I talked to you all about last unit as a uh, proxy war. It was a war in which um, both the United States and Russia had interest in the war. All right, and in the war with the two, the North and Vietnam, of course, America siding with South Vietnam and the Soviet Union siding with North. In August 1964, President Lyndon Johnson announced that North Vietnamese ships had attacked two American destroyers. This turned out to be untrue. So, why do you think um, President Johnson lied? Um, Johnson asked permission from Congress to let American forces defend themselves if attacked. Congress approved the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Viet Cong began attacking the military base in the South, which killed and wounded U.S. Advisor. In 1965, Johnson ordered U.S. jets to attack positions in the North. In March of 1965, Johnson launched an Operation Rolling Thunder, a bombing campaign of the North, and sent more than 180,000 troops to fight in Vietnam. In, er, in early 1968, military leaders announced that U.S. forces were gaining strength and winning the war. In late January 1968, the North Vietnamese launched a surprise attack during the Vietnamese New Year. They attacked nearly every U.S. air base, and most major cities in the South. Of course, this is called the Tet Offensive. The assassination of Viet Cong, as you can see, he was shot and killed. And you can see that they actually caught these images on paper, in picture. All right. Though the attack was a military failure, the Tet Offensive was a turning point in the war because most Americans came to believe that the U.S. could not win the war. President Johnson's approval rating dropped dramatically and eventually led Johnson not to seek re-election. Now, I'll add a little more to this in real time. All right, B, substandard B, connect major domestic issues to their social effects, including the passage of the civil rights legislation and Johnson's Great Society following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Assassination of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, especially toward the end of his presidency, was viewed as being very progressive toward the civil rights movement. In November 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Vice President Lyndon Johnson from Texas was sworn in as president. Politically, Johnson was very different than Kennedy. And he spent years in Congress, and he was actually the Speaker of the House, I believe it was. Majority Whip, Majority Whip. And he spent years in Congress and knew how to get things done. So he really had a connection to other congressmen. So it made it very, it proved to be an advantage for him because he was able to push legislation through much, I won't say easier or much at a much more flowing nature than many other presidents before, because he had connections to the Congress. Johnson's administration. Johnson carried on many of Kennedy's plans, including both the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed into law. The growing civil rights movement impressed Kennedy so much that he became convinced that the nation needed a civil rights law. Kennedy called on Congress to pass a sweeping civil rights bill. This bill outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. It also gave the government more power to push for school segregation. The act was signed into law by President Johnson. In 1965, civil rights workers attempted a voting project in Selma, Alabama. They were met with violent resistance. As a result, Martin Luther King Jr. led a massive march through Alabama. President Johnson responded by asking Congress to pass a new Voting Rights Act. Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The law eliminated state laws that had prevented African Americans from voting, like literacy tests and poll taxes. Now, there's a lot more to that story of the march in Selma, and that actually involved one of our House of Representatives or civil rights movement giants in Congressman John Lewis, who died earlier this year. And I'll speak more to you about that situation in real time. Describe the impact of television on American culture, including the presidential debate, Kennedy and Nixon in 1960, news coverage of the civil rights movement, the moon landing, and the war in Vietnam. Television became a big part of American culture. People were able to follow the news stories like the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. A big source of entertainment and had an impact on clothes, music, culture. Commercials also helped with teenage consumerism. Even though television was first introduced to the public in 1939, World War II prevented it from being manufactured and distributed, on a large scale until after the war. True regular commercial network television programming didn't begin in the U.S. until 1948. As you can see, this is what we call an analog television. You know, you got your knob up there on the right. You turn that knob to get your basic channels. All right, so that I think it used to go up to 1 to 20 or something like that, and then you get to 20, then it was like a U, and you turn that U, and then to get to the rest of those channels up to, I think it would go up to maybe 100. You would turn that bottom. So I know y'all don't know much about them analog TVs, but you know, my grandma used to have one of those TVs, and they used to be small. They wasn't colored like that. It was black and white, like more looks like the one on your right. But you know, those were analog TVs. Moving forward. All right. Describe the impact television had on American culture, including the presidential debates, Kennedy, Nixon, in 1960, new coverage of the civil rights. 70 million Americans turned in to watch the first ever presidential debate. Now, this was on TV, the first televised presidential debate. It was between Richard Nixon, who was the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and he was a foreign policy expert, so to speak. And Kennedy had little experience that Nixon wanted to expose that. John F. Kennedy looked a lot more confident on TV. Seeing this confidence made voters want him to be president. And I will speak more to you all and tell you a little nugget concerning that bit of history. All right, but moving on. All right, this is a picture of John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Kennedy on the far left over here is the taller individual on the left, and Nixon is the shorter individual on the right. And as you can see him Nixon behind the American flag and with the stars, and again Kennedy with the microphone. All right, moving forward. News coverage of the civil rights movement. Television, magazines, and newspapers covered this movement. Showing these boycotts and marches on television kept the civil rights movement on America's mind. Having it on television helped people start supporting the movement. And I'll talk to you all more about that in real time. But moving forward. The moon landing. July 20th, 1969, Kennedy challenged NASA to put a man on the moon. Apollo 11 was the first manned mission to the moon. The mission commander, Neil Armstrong, and the pilot was Buzz Aldrin. They left an American flag behind. The landing was watched all around the world. News coverage of the Vietnam War. Americans against the war in Vietnam became more vocal in their opposition. Many anti-war groups started on college campuses to urge the government to end the selective service, or what we might now know as the draft, and bring all American troops home from Vietnam. They used sit-ins, marches, and demonstrations. Later, some protesters became more radical, burning their draft cards, going to prison, or fleeing to Canada. Investigate, substandard D, investigate the growth, influence, and tactics of civil rights groups, such as Martin Luther King Jr., the letter from Birmingham Jail, the I Have a Dream speech, and Cesar Chavez. A letter from a Birmingham jail. Letter of Birmingham Jail was written by Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and became the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the CLC, which was one of the principal organizations of the civil rights movement in the United States. He advocated nonviolence resistance to patterns of racial injustice and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. I will talk to you in a little bit more detail about Dr. King in real time. Right. During a series of illegal, because a parade permit was denied to his group, demonstrations in 1963, protesting the segregation of many public facilities in Birmingham, King was arrested and sent to jail. He wrote a letter from his jail cell to local clergymen, or basically preachers or priests, who had criticized him for creating disorder in the city. School children were asked to participate in the demonstration. Organizers felt this may deter officials from opening fire hoses and releasing dogs on demonstrators. His letter from a Birmingham City Jail argued that individuals had the moral right and responsibility to disobey unjust laws. The letter was widely read at the time and added to King's standing as a moral leader. National reaction to the Birmingham violence built support for the struggle for Black civil rights. CLC was founded by Martin Luther King Jr. He preached nonviolence. He based his ideas on the teachings of Jesus, Gandhi, Henry David Thoreau, and A. Philip Randolph. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. joined with other ministers and civil rights leaders in 1957. Together they formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1960, another influential civil rights group emerged, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was formed mostly by college students. Members of this group felt that change for African Americans was occurring too slowly. One protest strategy that SNCC used was the sit-in. During the sit-in, blacks sat at white-only lunch counters. They refused to leave until they were served. In North Carolina, during a sit-in, students sat as whites hit them and poured food all over them, or all over their heads. By the late 1960s, they had desegregated lunch counters in 48 cities in 11 states. Another tactic used by SNCC members were freedom riders. Freedom riders rode public transportation into segregated areas in the South to challenge local laws and customs that enforce segregation. This caused national attention to areas that were disregarding the federal law of desegregation. All right, as you can see, here is a list that basically describe some of the differences and the similarities, basically compare and contrast the SNCC with, the SCLC, which was again developed by Dr. King, and the SNCC, Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, that was built by college students. So we'll go over this a little bit more in real time moving forward. And here we have one of the probably more famous speeches Martin Luther King gave, is the most famous speech that he gave. On August 28, 1963, under a nearly cloudless sky, more than 250,000 people, a fifth of them white, gathered near the Lincoln Memorial in Washington to rally for jobs and freedom. Dr. Martin Luther King had originally prepared a short speech. He was about to sit down when a gospel singer called out, "Tell them about your dream, Martin. Tell them about your dream." The gospel singer, I would believe, is Mahalia Jackson. In his speech, King asked for peace and racial harmony. All right, Cesar Chavez. All right, Latinos also protested to gain civil rights in the 1960s. Their leader was Cesar Chavez, a Mexican American from California. Chavez believed in nonviolent methods to achieve his goals. He started a nationwide boycott of California grapes, forcing growers to negotiate a contract with the United Farm Workers in 1970. This contract gave workers higher wages and other benefits. Last substandard E, describe the social and political turmoil of 1968, including the reactions to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, the Tet Offensive, and the presidential election. Now, first of all, 1968 was one of the most wildest years in U.S. history. I would even say this year would rival 1968 to a certain extent, but 1968 still takes the cake. In March, Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis, Tennessee to help support a strike by African American sanitation workers. In the early evening of April 4th, Dr. Martin Luther King was shot and killed by James Earl Ray. Supposedly, some people say differently. But we're going to go with that. King's death sparked a series of riots across the country. Then we have Robert F. Kennedy. This was shortly after Dr. Martin Luther King assassination in April. Robert Kennedy was probably killed around June or July. Robert Kennedy was also the brother of John Kennedy, who was the president, and he served as Attorney General under his brother's administration. Robert Kennedy, supporting many of his brother's civil rights policies, decided to run for president, and especially with Lyndon Johnson not running for president, this really opened the door for him. But I'm going to talk to you all more about that in real time. As a Democratic candidate, Kennedy went to California in June of 1968 and won that state's primary. All right. After greeting supporters at a hotel after his victory, Robert Kennedy was assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. By the end of 1968, 2 national leaders had been assassinated. The 1968 Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago, Illinois. There were 4,000 anti-war demonstrators against Vietnam, of course, that tried to march to the convention site, but were met by over 11,000 Army and National Guardsmen and Chicago riot police. The protesters and bystanders were met with tear gas and beaten by the police, all within the full view of television cameras during the Democratic National Convention. So it was insane. But I'll talk to you all about that more in real time. All right. Question. It's not going to be necessary to take it out the door, but this will be a question that we will discuss. Of the people we have discussed in this standard, MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Robert F. Kennedy, whose assassination had the largest impact on America? And we'll discuss that. All right. The election of 1968 it ended up being Richard Nixon versus Herbert Humphreys, because of course the leading Democratic nominee at the time was actually still Robert F. Kennedy, but because he was assassinated, it ended up being Herbert Humphreys that was chosen. Nixon promised peace with honor of the U.S. removal from Vietnam. Nixon targeted the poor, black, and young, known as the silent majority. Nixon won and wanted to replace federal government with more involvement from state and local governments. But we'll discuss Nixon at a later time. But hey, I may discuss it in real time, depending on how much time we have left. That's all I have for you guys today, as far as the presentation. So take it away, Mr. Johnson.